This is NBC News Update, brought to you by Conoco. Here is Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Congressman John Jenrette was found guilty tonight of accepting a bribe in the FBI's abscam case.
I'm beginning to wonder about the whole system.
Tough talk on the campaign trail today. Ronald Reagan described President Carter as a badly misinformed and prejudiced man. That was in response to Mr. Carter's charge that a Reagan presidency would divide the country into racial and religious factions. And the Iran-Iraq war today centered on the Iranian oil port of Abadan. Iraq wants it because it's close to the waterway leading to the Persian Gulf. I'm Jessica Savage in Washington. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Dunlop Tire. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. The British Foreign Secretary is on his way home to London tonight. He's taking with him a new American plan for avoiding war over the Falkland Islands. But supposedly the plan is not going to satisfy the British. The British fleet, meanwhile, has its own troubles. It's within range of Argentine planes and in the middle of a hurricane. Now this.
What could possibly go farther than Dunlop's DDH golf ball?
Only Dunlop Radio Tires.
And a heavenly ride, too.
Some U.S. automakers are a little happier tonight. Average sales are up 5.8% this April over what they were last April. In fact, though, only GM and Ford sales have increased. Chrysler and AMC sales have declined from a year ago. I'm Linda Ellerby in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update. Here is Linda Ellerby.
Good evening. Tonight, the State Department says Secretary of State Haig has not made an offer to Cuba to cut its ties with Moscow. And sources in Havana now say Castro wouldn't consider it anyway. The White House says it's good news that consumer prices last month took the sharpest drop in 29 years. But the cause of it is mostly a steep recession. The March decrease means Social Security checks will only be going up an average of $27 a month starting in July. And there's a new world record in Pac-Man. That's a video game. And a postal worker in Spokane racked up 2.9 million points in 6 hours and on 1 quarter's worth of ghosty gobbling. I'm Linda Ellerby in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update. Here is Lloyd Dobbins.
Good evening. Budget negotiators meet in Washington again tomorrow. They'll try to reach a compromise that could include a cut in defense spending. The Brookings Institution says the defense budget could be cut, helping the budget and not hurting national security. If arms cost money, they also make money. The United States will sell $30 billion worth of arms abroad this year, and that's an all-time record for any nation. Attorney General Smith says illegal aliens are taking jobs away from citizens, and he says we can no longer tolerate that. He wants a crackdown. I'm Lloyd Dobbins in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Capsule, sponsored by Commodore VIC-20. Here is Bill Schechner.
Despite a rise last month, the rate of wholesale inflation is running at the lowest level in 6 years, 3.7%. Retail sales were up 2.3% last month, the best since May. President Reagan urged the Senate to overturn the House refusal to fund the MX missile. If that happens, Reagan said he'd welcome debate on how to deploy the MX. More in a moment.
Become great at a game machine. Maybe you can score 16 million on Space Invaders. Become great at the Commodore VIC-20. Maybe you can score 1,600 on the college boards.
A presidential commission, stymied by inability of the White House and Congress to reach a compromise, has delayed until next Friday recommendations to keep Social Security solvent. And President Reagan has offered to ease U.S. sanctions if Poland ends repression. I'm Bill Schechner in New York. More news later on this NBC station and NBC News Overnight.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Atari. Here is Stephen Frazier.
Good evening. Soviet President Leonid Brezhnev said today his country is ready to start negotiations on nuclear arms reductions. He proposed a freeze on the modernization of strategic arms. President Reagan welcomed Brezhnev's willingness to talk, but rejected a freeze now. Argentine officials said British warships shelled the Falkland Islands again today. The rest of the British fleet is poised for invasion, but United Nations peace talks were suspended for one day so the Argentines can consider the British position. Now this.
This is the Defender home video game. Coming soon, only from Atari and only for Atari systems.
In New York, a federal jury found the Reverend Sun Myung Moon guilty of income tax evasion. The founder of the Unification Church could spend 14 years in jail. I'm Stephen Frazier in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Update, sponsored by Budweiser. Here is Stephen Frazier.
Good evening. In Puerto Rico today, a battle between police and 300 squatters living on government land. A policeman was killed. 10 people were hurt. The squatters were evicted. Turnout heavy today at polls around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Neighbors of the nuclear power plant at 3 Mile Island were asked if they favor a partial restart of the plant, crippled 3 years ago in the nation's worst nuclear accident. Argentine diplomats at the United Nations responded tonight to the latest British peace proposal. The response isn't known yet. One official said it reaffirms Argentina's wish for a peaceful settlement. Now this.
Here's to the New York Islanders for skating their way to a Stanley Cup hat trick. This Bud's for you.
The United Auto Workers tonight granted American Motors a package of concessions adding up to $115 million. I'm Stephen Frazier in New York. More news later on this NBC station.
This is NBC News Digest, sponsored by Apple Computers. Here is John Hart, NBC News.
Good evening. Romania, the only Soviet satellite coming to the Olympic Games, said it's sure security at the Games will be guaranteed. A Romanian Olympic official also said there was no pressure to stay away. An East German attaché at the UN is missing from his New York apartment where the door was open and his keys on the table. He was last seen Wednesday. Now this.
Why learn all of this when you can use Macintosh by simply learning this? Macintosh.
President Reagan contradicted a Marine Corps general who said conventional war with the Soviets is an almost inevitable probability, the president calling that a dangerous idea. In Illinois, 16,000 chickens died when electrical failure cut off ventilation fans in an egg farm. I'm John Hart. More news later on this NBC station.